Hey nerdy knitters, have you ever been knitting a shawl and you loved the pattern but you weren't sure about the construction? You couldn't quite understand why it was knit the way it was. Well, we've been deciphering different shawl shapes, and in this video we're going to look at the half pie shawl and why it's constructed the way it is. Once you understand how it's constructed, you can use it to create your own unique shawl. But before we jump into that, let me just say, hey, I'm Tanya here at Nerdy Knitting. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a knitwear designer, and my goal is to help you become a more confident, adventurous knitter. Before we look at the construction of a half pie shawl, let's look at the background of the creation of this type of shawl. It was invented by Elizabeth Zimmermann. She invented the half pie shawl and the pie shawl, along with many other things that she contributed to the knitting world, most notably her percentage system for knitting sweaters. So Elizabeth Zimmermann took this mathematical knowledge and applied it to shawl knitting as well, with the creation of her pie shawl and half pie shawl. She realized that as the diameter of the shawl doubled, the diameter being the row count, that the stitch count or the circumference also had to double. And that gave us the two basic rules that apply to all pie shawls and half pie shawls. The first rule is that on your increase rows, your stitch count has to double. And the second rule is between those increase rounds, you have to work twice the number of rows that you did in the previous section. Now these two rules can be adjusted to accommodate stitch patterns or other design elements. So let's look at this in action. You start by casting on. You can use any basic cast on you want. In this sample, I cast on 9 stitches and I worked a stockinette stitch tab. Then after the tab was done and I had picked up all of my stitches, I worked a setup row. I knit the 3 edge stitches, I placed a marker, purled across the body stitches to create the stockinette shawl, so I'm knitting on the right side rows, purling on the wrong side rows, placed another marker, and then knit the last 3 edge stitches. And that gets us set up, so we're ready to go. Then after that setup row, you get right to your first increase row. The increase row following our first rule, doubling the stitch count. So on the very next row, you double the stitch count of the body. Now I'm not counting those edge stitches, that's why I've placed those markers. Those 3 stitches at either side aren't counting. I have 3 stitches for the body, so I'm going to double those. So I'm going to work a yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 1, and that doubles my stitch count. So that covers the first rule, how to increase your stitch count. And then the second rule is the number of rows you have to work. Now, you're supposed to work twice the amount of rows as worked in the previous section. In this case, I only had the 1 row worked before our increase row. If we doubled that, we would work 2 rows. But I prefer to work all of the increase rows on right side rows, and if we strictly follow this rule, we'll be working increase rows on the wrong side rows as well. So we're going to fudge this rule a little bit and we'll work 3 rows instead. Then once you've set things up and you've worked those 3 rows, you're going to follow those 2 rules again. You'll work another increase row, doubling the stitch count of the shawl body, not those edge stitches. So we had 6 stitches, we'll double that to 12 stitches. And then our next rule tells us how many rows we need to work. We just finished 3 rows, so we're going to double that. It will be 6, but that will put our next increase row on a wrong side row, so we'll add 1 more row and call it 7 rows. So we'll increase and then we'll work 7 rows. And then you just continue repeating that, working your increase row, working double the amount of rows in between, working another increase row, and then working double the amount of rows in between. You continue doing that until the shawl is as large as you want, and then bind off with stretchy bind off. I know it might seem confusing, but it's really not. If you cast on a little sample and give it a try, download this free printable, follow the pattern, and you'll see exactly how simple this shawl shape can be. Now, there are really a lot of ways to play with this shape. Once you understand the 2 rules, you can work in any fabric you like. What's really interesting is that you have the same amount of stitches for a whole section, however many rows between your increase rows. So you can add a stitch pattern in there as well, something that would fit with the multiple of stitches that you have. So it's a really great way to use different stitch patterns because you don't have stitch counts constantly changing every single row. Here's an example of a half pie shawl, the Vostok shawl by Beth Kling. You can see those yarn over increase rows, and between each of those she works different stitch patterns. Now be sure to grab that free download and you can start knitting your own half pie shawl today. And if you're looking for more ways to knit half circle shawls, then check out this video right here.